Hello, widowhood. Our guest today is Mr. David Roberts, but he goes by Dave. He is a MSW, LMSW, and we're going to get into all those initials because I certainly want to know. He became a parent who experienced the death of his child when his daughter Janine died of cancer on March 1st, 2003, at the age of 18. He is a retired addiction professional and adjunct professor in the psychology, child, and life department of Utica University in Utica, New York. Dave also teaches psychology classes at Pratt Munson School of Arts of Design. He hosts the Teaching Journey podcast, which can be found on most podcast platforms. Dave has presented workshops, national conferences, and compassionate friends, and for the bereaved parents of the USA. He was also a keynote speaker at the 2011 and 2015 National Gatherings of Bereaved Parents of the USA. Dave also co-presented a workshop titled Helping Faculty After Traumatic Loss for the Parkland, Florida community in 2018 in the aftermath of the mass shooting for the Stoneman Douglas High School. Dave has been a HuffPuff contributor and has contributed articles to Medium, Open to Hope Foundation, Mindfulness and Grief, Thrive Global, and Recovering the Self Journal. He has also appeared on numerous podcasts as well as Open to Hope Television. He co-authored a book with Reverend Patty Farrell titled When the Psychology Professor Met the Minister, which was published on March 1st, 2021. Your ability and the links to contact Dave are going to be in the show notes and on the comments in the YouTube channel. Welcome, Dave, to the Widowhood.
Many people talk about the ups and downs of married life, but no one really prepares you for life after your spouse passes away. Welcome to Widowhood Real Talk with Tina, a safe place for widows, widowers, and their friends and family to talk about love and loss. Find comfort as you listen to honest conversations between Tina and invited guests who've experienced the loss of their forever partner. Share their stories of love, grief, and healing. You are not alone in this journey. Join today's episode and discover a wealth of resources and learn how to connect with others who are traveling the same path. This is Widowhood Real Talk with Tina.
Tina, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to our conversation for some time now.
Oh, thank you so much. I am sorry for the death of your daughter, Janine. That I know it becomes something you learn to carry, but it's still something that you are carrying, that has shifted the part of your life.
Yeah, yes, it has, Tina. I mean, certainly one of the things that I never envisioned having to do as a parent was bury my child. Or it was something that was unfathomable to me. It was something I didn't even consider. It was so far removed from my consciousness that I never considered it. And then when she got sick, and as she got progressively more ill, and she began to deteriorate progressively from her cancer, it was I was going to be walking a path that I never thought I'd ever be walking. And the thing with her cancer is that it was a rare form of cancer that called Velar rhabdomyosarcoma. And she was diagnosed approximately 3 weeks after giving birth to her only child and my first grandchild, Brianna. And Brianna was born on May 2nd. I had just gotten my master's in social work degree. I had that degree conferred upon me May 19th, and May 26th, she was officially diagnosed with the Velar rhabdomyosarcoma. The diagnosis was confirmed approximately a week later. I think it was June 3rd. At the Dana-Farber Research Institute, which is in Boston, which is one of the premier, if not the premier, hospital and research center for pediatric sarcomas. In a 5-minute consult, they basically said that she had stage 4 cancer with bone marrow and lymph node involvement, and there was absolutely no cure for her cancer. The only hope that they had was to put her cancer in permanent remission until they could find a cure. So at that moment, Tina, what I heard, and I know my daughter heard, was that in all likelihood, unless there's a miracle, she's going to die.
Yeah.
And from 10 months from diagnosis to death, and I call her death now a transition from the physical body into the spiritual world. She transitioned 10 months after being diagnosed. So it was a relatively quick progression. Her pregnancy and complicated diagnosis with sarcomas, they have to be diagnosed early. What had happened is she had injured her right foot in a freak accident during pregnancy. Her foot got progressively more swollen, did not respond to traditional treatments for a swollen foot. And an MRI revealed an undefined 8 centimeter mass in the bottom of her foot. And it was biopsied, and it was found to be a malignant tumor. And the rest has set me on a path that's been a mosaic of a lot of different emotions, but ultimately ended up with transformation, learning how to transcend grief and find peace with what had happened and be grateful for what I have in my life. But it's been a long journey to get there. So,
And you said a lot there. There is so much to go back, impact. The concept of mosaic, is that a term you use often? And what does that symbolize for you in this process?
well, one of the things, mosaic, I kind of look at it as kind of a combination of a lot of different emotions, a lot of different states of mind. One of the things that I discovered is that happiness by itself is not the key to success, especially after experiencing tragedy. I would ask certain people, "How you doing today?" And this was before my loss, and they'd say, "Great, best day of my life." And then I began to, especially after my loss, I began to think about it. I said, nobody can be happy 24/7. That just takes too much energy. I mean, to me, it takes too much energy, and it isn't realistic, because even if you haven't experienced tragedy, happiness 24 hours a day isn't realistic. There's going to be periods of sadness. There's going to be periods of pensiveness. There's going to be periods of confusion. There's going to be periods of anxiety. But, it all has something to teach us, and it makes us who we are. To deny all of those aspects of our lives is to deny the mosaic that ultimately is a part of who we are. I mean, emotions, good and bad, make up who we are. We can learn from all of it. And it's about being genuine. It's about genuineness. I tell my students at Utica University, if you're talking to somebody who's had a tragedy, don't ask them how they're doing today unless you have time for the answer, because they may need to talk.
Yes.
And that sometimes is not going to be pretty, but you have to witness all of that. You have to witness whatever anger they may be experiencing, sadness, tears. It's all a part of working through that grief to ultimately get to a point of peace. And there's no absolute time frame for that progression to happen. So I always look at the path that I walk as a mosaic that's comprised of a variety of different emotions that make up my genuine self, so that when you ask me how I'm doing, you're going to get a genuine answer in that moment. And so I tell my students jokingly, and anybody else, I don't hang around with totally happy people anymore. If somebody asks me, if I ask somebody how they're doing, say, "Dave, today really stinks," I can sit down and have a conversation with them, because I know they're being genuine, and I know that's where they're at, and I can deal with that.
Thank you. You touched on something that is often discussed in the breathing community. How are you doing today? The question would come, what does one ask? How do they approach? And I know this is from your learned experience. You're not, every person is different. From your experience, what would be the alternative for people to do instead of being quite oddly quiet and just staring? What was the best way to approach you?
I think just out of sincerity, and I could tell through, nonverbal language of somebody who's being sincere. I think, first of all, be sincere with your response. I mean, a lot of times we say things that we think are going to be meaningful and helpful, but depending on where that person is at, they're not going to interpret it that way. So first and foremost, be sincere in terms of what you are going to suggest. I tend to get away from how are you doing, because that's kind of a loaded question for me. If you ask somebody how they're doing in general, I mean, you can get any kind of an answer. So essentially what I might do is, how are you doing today? How are you doing in this moment? Or the other thing is, if I might say, if I'm thinking, let's say I might check in with you and say, "Tina, you were in my thoughts today. I just wanted to check in." That's another way of asking how you're doing, And what that does is it gives you or the person who is grieving, it empowers them to respond to that in a way that reflects how they're feeling in the moment, as opposed to, yeah, I'm doing fine. Because a lot of times somebody will ask you how you're doing, and you'll say fine because you don't want to get into how you're doing. So I usually keep those questions realistic in terms of how are you doing this moment or today, or just do an email or a quick text or even a phone call. And if the person doesn't pick up, leave a message. Just say, hey, John, I was thinking of you today. I just wanted to check in. And that's it. And that gives, again, that the person empowers that person to answer it in a way that's what they're going to see fit at that moment.
Thank you for sharing that. So let's get back to these alphabets. What is MSM and what is LMSW?
Yeah, those MSW means I got a master's in social work degree. That's
Okay.
like I had a bachelor's degree from, actually back then it was Utica College. I got my bachelor's degree in 1977 in psychology. And then 25 years later, I got my master's in social work degree, which meant, I went 4 years part-time, but basically if I went full-time, it would have been 2 years to get my graduate degree. LMSW is a licensed master social worker, which it's the first level of licensure that you can get in New York State with a master's in social work degree. And in the past, I've done private practice with the LMSW, but under the supervision of a licensed clinical social worker. So those are initials that are, I don't really use them all that much except for bios for podcast or if I'm doing a conference on it. But other than that, I'm just Dave.
Okay, Dave, I want you to speak to someone that is going to school part-time and they feel like it's not worth it and they're thinking about quitting.
First of all, I can tell you, going to school part-time and working full-time, which is challenging. What I would tell somebody who is looking at that decision, I would want to find out, is this something that you've been thinking about for a while, or did something happen that just came up that caused you to go in that direction? So the first and foremost I would want to do is, like I would do with anybody, is listen to the story surrounding their decision. What is going on? First and foremost, establish myself as a listener and just say, tell me what's going on. What happened? How long have you been thinking of quitting? Was this a sudden decision, or was this something you've been thinking about? Tell me about your experience that has led you to this point. So the first and foremost is establish myself as a listener, get the full story, and then respond. My role is not to talk anybody into doing what I think they should do. My role is to listen, to offer suggestions, to ask them, have you considered a particular course of action? Have you considered this alternative? Have you considered talking to your advisor? So I would throw out suggestions with the understanding that they are empowered to do whatever they want to do with any type of suggestion. And I always tell my students, don't put suggestions out as observations, because with observations, person who's receiving, on the receiving end of the observation, has three choices, Tina. They can either accept the observation and say, yeah, it's valid and it applies to me and I'll implement those suggestions. They can choose to say, well, some of it resonates, but other parts of it I either need to consider or they don't resonate. Or the third option is they can reject it totally. So it's basically, it's understanding that we're here to offer suggestions. We're here to guide individuals to look at specific paths, but ultimately it's their path to walk. It's not mine to walk for them. Or I don't want them to walk it the way they think I should walk it.
I see. What are some of your favorite memories of your daughter?
Oh, wow. How much time we got?
As much as you want. This is your
Okay.
journey. And we get to honor her and celebrate her and her memories.
Wow. One of the biggest memories, I tell the story in my death, dying, and bereavement class that I teach at Utica University, or workshops that I do. I used to have a 1993 Jeep Cherokee, and it was one of those, if you remember the old Jeeps in 93,
I'm a Jeep girl. I have a
You're a
Jeep
Jeep girl.
Wrangler right now. I've had a Jeep Cherokee,
Yeah.
Jeep Sport. Yes, I've
Yeah.
had like 4 different ones.
Well, this Jeep Cherokee that I had, Tina, did not take bumps very well, but
It sounds about Jeepish.
yeah, but But my daughter said to me, she goes, she was a passenger in my Jeep. So in her own indomitable fashion, and Janine was honest, did not mince any words. She was never disrespectful, but she just, you asked her a question, she'd give you an honest answer. And you might not like the answer, but you knew it was honest. So she walked up to me one day and she goes, Dad, your Jeep stinks. I said, okay. She goes, I'm going to take you out. We're going to buy you a deodorizer so your Jeep can smell nice. So we went to Pep Boys, I think they have a chain of shops throughout the United States.
Yes.
And we had a Pep Boys right around the corner from us. And I remember this, Tina, I can remember this vividly. And this is one of the memories that keeps me strongly connected to my daughter. We went into Pep Boys. It was a summer day. I remember I had a pair of shorts on and a shirt. I had to make sure I qualified that I had a shirt on. And she was standing to the right of me. And the young man that waited on us had like sandy brown hair, probably about 5'10". And so Janine walked up, found this Pine deodorizer. It's a clip-on that you clip onto your heating system and air conditioning system, and you turn on and it makes your car all smell nice. So she got the fan, and I'll give you and your audience two guesses on who ended up paying for it.
You?
I paid for it.
Yeah.
She just needed to get me out of the house.
It was your Jeep. It was your responsibility.
It was my responsibility, but she said she was going to pay for it. I wouldn't make her pay for it. I would have done that. So whenever I tell that story, it's like I'm experiencing it in real time. And I still have the deodorizing fan sitting on my desk. I still have that. I managed to find it 6 months after she transitioned to one of the remote nook and crannies that this house has. I opened up an old compartment that we used to keep a landline phone in, and the fan was sitting right there. And I kind of think I was meant to find that. And I always tell that story in terms of how I stay connected to my daughters, among many things. And then there was another time that we were walking in one of the local malls, and she saw this daddy's little girl bracelet, and we were walking, and she goes, you're going to buy that for me for Christmas. Now, of course, I had to buy it for her for Christmas. And she had a smile that would disarm me. She would go to her mother and say, Mom, can I have some money? She goes, no. She goes, that's all right. I'll talk to Dad. He'll give it to me. And of course I did. And because she would smile at me, and she was Daddy's little girl. And with that locket was buried with her. That's one of the things we wanted to make sure was buried with her. I have one other memory, if we have time to share, that I think.
Absolutely.
Okay. There's one thing that this will tell you a lot about how she approached her illness. We're going to go back to Dana-Farber in June. We drove home after we got the diagnosis and the prognosis. We drove home pretty much in silence. It was a 5-hour drive from Boston to upstate New York, where I live. And I was hitting every bump in the road in my Jeep. And she was screaming out in pain, yelling and screaming. I tried to go fast. I tried to go slow. Nothing worked. I got home, and I may tend to get a little emotional telling this part of the story, but I got home. She sat on the couch in the living room. I walked up to her, and all of a sudden I just buried my head in her hand. I started crying like a baby. And I have never cried that hard since. I cried and I cried and I cried. And I looked at her and I said, honey, I'm so sorry that I didn't mean to cause you so much pain, with my driving. And I looked up and she started to tear up, and she looked at me and she goes, Dad, I only yelled because I was in so much pain. She said, but if you can't sleep, you come and find me and we'll talk. So I'm thinking this will tell you how she approached her illness. And she said to me, she goes, I'm not going down without a fight. I said, I'm not expecting that you would. And I left thinking, here's my daughter who at 18 years old was thinking about was a new mother, embarking on motherhood. And all of a sudden, 3 weeks later, we find out that in all likelihood, she's going to die unless there's a miracle. And she's comforting me, and I'm a wreck. And I drew strength from that. I kind of figured if she wasn't going down without a fight, I wasn't either. And her gumption, her compassion that she showed me in the midst of her terminal illness and her diagnosis was something that inspired me to at least to get through what I needed to get through with her illness. And I'll always remember that. I mean, she taught me a lot about the resilience of the human spirit just with that one statement and that one interchange that we had. So those are the three. I could go on and on and on and on, but those are the three memories that really stand out to me right now.
Your daughter, amazing woman, amazing woman.
Yes, she is. And I still talk about her in the present tense because she's still a part of who I am, and she's still around, and I know she's around. But yeah, she's an amazing young lady and wise beyond her years. You know, we had 300 individuals pay tribute to her at her celebration of life, which, you know, and you never truly understand the impact of a life. You really, truly never realize what impact life has on others. But seeing 300 people there was just told me that she just had a widespread impact in her short 18 years of life on Earth.
In those 300 people speaking, did you learn something about Janine you didn't know before?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. Oh, wait a minute. Yes. It wasn't actually at the celebration of life. It was a phone call that I received after her transition. And Janine was an animal caretaker at a place called Spring Farms. And they work with animals that physical health challenges and are typically, and they're not typically in the end stage of their life. And she was working with a horse called Poppy J that could not walk. And there's one picture that I have. I don't have it handy, but there's one picture that I have where actually Janine is on the ground in the barn looking face to face with Poppy J, that maintaining eye level. And it was one of the most magnificent pictures that I had ever seen. And I didn't take it, but I think it was somebody there that did, and it was sent to me afterward. The woman whose horse that was called, and I talked with her, and she wanted to know how Janine was doing, and I told her that Janine had transitioned. At the time, I told her that she had died, because that's how I conceptualized death at the time. And so we talked, and she goes, "Your daughter was so good to Poppy J. She was such a beautiful young lady. She really helped prolong his life just with the care that she gave him." And I knew she loved animals. I knew she loved working at Spring Farms, but I didn't realize what an impact that she had on animals. I mean, she was like had a bond with them that I couldn't really truly understand, and that I didn't really truly appreciate until that conversation. So, and just other people just came up during and told me how great what a good young lady she was, what a good friend she was, and everything about her. Just so, I mean, these were things that I had already suspected, but the call that I got after her transition was the thing that had surprised me the most, I think, at that time.
Thank you, Dave. How have you changed the way you show up in life or impacted by Janine's transition?
Well, first of all, I think her death, the sadness that I experienced, the profound sadness and grief that I experienced after her death, has transformed into just endless compassion that I have for individuals who have transcended, who are dealing with tragedy or trying to transcend tragedy, and also has, I think, translated to my concern for the well-being and education of the students that I work with. You know, my students have a lot of challenges that go beyond trying to negotiate the world of academia and financial aid and finances. They have their own challenges with depression, anxiety, and loss. And I've learned through my challenges with Janine's death, I've learned to take that holistic approach with students as well, too. They're just not students. The student is what their primary goal is at this point, as far as furthering their career, either academically and professionally. But they also have other categories of their lives that I've learned to honor, especially when I have a student come in and just say, "Look, I had a death in the family." And I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to make them come to class? Because that's not going to happen. Because for me, I was out of work for 3 months. I told my bosses, I said, you're going to have to do without me for a while. I'll work it out, but you're going to have to do without me. And I was out for 3 months just trying to provide as much support as I could to my daughter in the early stages. So, I mean, other things that I've learned, the quality of relationships are more important than the amount of money in my checkbook. I've learned that abundance is not measured just by material things or by money. It's through the people you have in your life, the quality of your relationships, those people who can give you a lot of teachable moments and support. I also learned that the world of psychology and spirituality could merge quite nicely to help individuals expand their thinking, to develop critical thinking, and to transcend challenge. And I was very much in the world of science. I rejected spirituality. I rejected anything that I could not see with my full senses. And then everything changed about 7 years after my daughter transitioned in terms of who I met. And, you mentioned earlier about the book When the Psychology Professor Met the Minister. I met Reverend Patty Farino 7 years after Janine transitioned through pure serendipity. I couldn't make this story up in terms of how we met. So would you like me to get into just a little bit of that right now? Or do you want to hold off?
I want to hold off. I wanted to get to that part of the story, but there's a timeline I wanted to get to just
Okay.
before that. But
Okay.
we will certainly touch upon
Okay.
that.
But let's just say the work I was doing up until that time was work that I think any parent who'd experienced the death of a child would be expected to do. And I thought I was doing fairly well.
Well, that actually goes into my question.
Okay.
You're actually leaning in and seeing how you're a podcaster, you know how this goes. It's a little
That's right.
different on this side. My next question was going to be, how did you manage your grief?
In the
What was that
begin,
process for you?
well, in the beginning, it was, and actually it was my wife, Sherry, who I need to credit for this. She found a really good bereaved parent support group that was sponsored by a local funeral home. And this was about 6 months after Janine had transitioned. And she said, why don't we go? And of course, I did the man thing and said, yeah, I'll go. And I was going to go to support her, I'll go I'll man up and I'll support you. But I got there in 5 minutes, 5 minutes after I got there, I realized that I needed support for myself. That reasoning for me initially going just went out the window in about 5 minutes. One of the things that I felt like I was alone, and I could have felt alone in a group of people, because one of the things that happened for me is that my whole world changed. My world became terrifying. My world became uncertain, and I had to figure out how I was going to negotiate all of that. I didn't have a clue. So the first thing that I think helped me was finding a support group of parents that also had experienced the unthinkable. The first night I went in there, Tina, there had to be 18 other parents. So immediately I didn't feel alone. I felt saddened that we were all brought together, but I soon learned through this group that our shared pain was a gateway to hope. We could work through our pain with each other because we could uniquely understand the challenges of losing a child. So that was the first thing that helped. The second thing was I began to read memoirs from other bereaved parents, books about grief, articles about grief, and also I would, to try to see what parents farther along than me in the grief journey were doing. They had talked, some parents had talked about doing this for 5 years. I'm thinking to myself, geez, I can't even do this for 5 minutes, much less 5 years. So how did you get to 5 years? What did you do? What resources did you help that helped you? So I asked questions. I got into my teacher and probably scientific inquiry mode and just asked questions. How did you do this? Eventually, I then began to do some writing. I got an offer to write for a magazine, just an article for a magazine. And then I started doing workshops for the Compassionate Friends. And I started to try to share at least, some of my knowledge that I accumulated up until this point. This was like 2009. So this was 6 years in. I started by all intents and purposes, re-engaging in life according to the Bereaved Parents Playbook. I was going to support groups. I was working through my grief. I was reading. I was looking for support. I was sharing what I learned. I was trying to re-engage in life with purpose. So that was like the first 6 to 7 years. But, as we're going to find out later, there was something missing. There was a missing ingredient.
I have two other questions before we get to that point of pivot. How have you and your wife grieved differently or the same?
Well, this gets into the old gender differences in terms of how men and women grieve, and we grieve very differently. My wife was very open with her emotions. She would cry when she needed to cry. Me, I would cry privately. I would try to distract or work through my emotions. I still felt as intensely as she did, but I just dealt with it differently. You know, if I had a nickel for every woman that has come up to me and said my boyfriend does not express his feelings, I'd be a rich guy. I said because a lot of men don't have a vocabulary for feelings. We experience them, but we're not we may not. Most men aren't as emotive with them as our women would like us to be. But so for me, I was very much into my head. And if you asked me what I was thinking as opposed to what I was feeling initially, I could tell you what I was thinking. And then I could tell you what I was feeling after I told you what I was thinking. Because one of the things I've always suggested to anybody who wants to be a therapist working with men and emotions, don't ask them initially how they're feeling because they may not have a vocabulary for feelings. Because most men have been taught to suck it up, that feelings are a sign of weakness. So you need to and you need to take care of everybody else. You need to take care of your family. You need to be strong for them. So feelings are something that we kind of have a love and mostly hate relationship with. So I suggest individuals ask a guy what they're thinking. So if I say, boy, this really stinks, well, how does that make you feel? Well, I'm angry. I'm confused. I'm sad. That's how you get to that. And so for my wife and me, it was just understanding our unique grieving styles. I could respect how she was feeling. I could respect her tears, and she could respect what I was thinking. And she knew that she could get to my grief by asking me, what are you thinking about today? What are your thoughts today? You look like you're deep in thought. And so that helped us strengthen our relationship because we understood our unique grieving styles. There isn't any right or wrong way to grieve. It's basically what's going to work for us. As long as it's not getting us arrested, as long as we're not hurting ourselves or somebody else, it all works. And it's just a matter of understanding it, respecting it, and holding space for it. The other thing, and I've said this on other podcasts, and I want to say it here. A lot of times, I'm sure you've heard this, where a woman starts crying and their husband or boyfriend says, well, stop crying. You know, you've probably heard this before. And it's like, well, does the man really not is trying to disempower a woman from expressing her emotions? A woman's tears and their family's tears mean more to men than just the tears itself. As men, you know, we've been conditioned to be the protectors. And I can speak of our family, and I can speak from my own experience, Tina, that when I saw my wife cry or my Janine's older and younger brother in distress, it was a reminder to me that I couldn't fix what happened. It was a reminder to me that I failed as my job as a protector. Mm-hmm. So those tears went to the essence of what I thought my manhood should have been.
Wow, thank you. And you actually led into my next question. How did you see or observe your son in this process, grieving his sister?
My youngest son was there right from the beginning. He was 13 when Janine got sick, so her illness was his introduction to puberty, which is a heck of a way to be introduced to puberty. So when my wife or Janine's significant other, and this is the other part of the story, her significant other, Brianna, their cat, moved in with me, Sherry, my two boys, Dan and Matt, and our two cats. So the running joke in the neighborhood was how many 2- and 4-leggeds could you get in a lower level at a 1-level ranch? And we tested that. We tested that theory. And her significant other stayed with us for 4 years after Janine transitioned. Janine had asked him to do that, and he was 19 at the time she got sick. She asked him to do that just so that Brianna wouldn't be uprooted. She said, I know you won't, we talked about putting her in a certain school system, but stay with my parents for until she's ready. And he did. He kept his promise to her. He kept his promise to us. And that's something that I will always, and we still see him, not as much as we used to, since now Brianna's 22 years old and, she's on her own, but I'll never forget that he was a man of his word. And I will always remember that. So that was the other part of that. And, it was an interesting situation.
So now tell us the part you want to get to. bring us up to this moment about the book and the psychologist meeting and the spirit child. Oh, I'm ready for it now.
You're ready for it? Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Perfect.
Like you're
That's
biting at the chumps to tell. But I was like, I know there was
hey,
some things between there, and I wanted to make sure we.
that's why I wanted to check with you first, because as a podcast host myself, I always am mindful. Is there someplace you want to go? Or I'm always respectful of the plan that other podcast hosts have for their shows, because you know your audience and you have better than I do, and also you have a system, and I never want to interrupt that. So we're going to fast forward to August 25th, 2010. I was I was on a committee to organize a grief conference in the Oneida, New York area at the Turning Stone Resort Casino. It was called Beyond Words: Creative Approaches to Grief. Reverend Patty Farino had heard about the conference through another colleague and friend who was the chapter leader of one of the Long Island chapters of the Bereaved Parents of the USA. So she got the information and said, boy, I really would like to go. So she thought about it. She goes, yeah, maybe I can pick up something that is going to be useful to me, because at the time she was a volunteer minister at the Angel of Hope in Long Island. The Angel of Hope is a statue that is erected in honor of children who have transitioned, died, or passed on, depending on how you conceptualize death. And it's a kind of like a memorial and a place, a remembrance area where parents can come talk about their children. And Patty did a lot of outreach work and did a lot of companionship with parents who had experienced a transition of their child. So she figured, yeah, if I go to this grief conference, I might be able to pick up some stuff. So she pictured this. Every registration was online. She picked out her workshops, double checked to make sure that those were the workshops she wanted, checked her credit card information, hit submit, the computer screen went blank. So she saw the number at the end. If you're having a problem with registration, call this number. And that number happened to be my number. And I was working at the time, but my office was in a remote location where, I could have some privacy. So she called, and I think it was around lunchtime. And we talked we got her registration straightened out. We talked for about 45 minutes. So I asked her, I said, have you experienced the death of a child? She goes, no. She goes, but she told me about her work with the Angel of Hope. And she also told me that she had worked with a lot of parents that had experienced the transition of a child. And there were two children in particular that had touched her heart, and that, she had fond memories of. So after we shared stories and shared a few tears, she asked me, she goes, well, do you believe in signs? I said, Patty, I'm not really out for that kind of stuff. I'm a psychology-based guy. I'm science-based. And in retrospect, it wasn't that I didn't believe in signs, because there were some things that were happening, some really weird stuff at the time that was happening to me about 6 months or so after Janine transitioned. I'd be walking Brianna in her carriage around the block, and her butterfly would be following us. And I'm kind of thinking, well, that's weird. Butterflies usually don't do that, but they were followed. It's like he was taking a flying walk with us. So I started thinking, well, and then another times I would hear songs on the radio, and I was thinking of her, and all of a sudden, a song on the radio that we liked came on. And I'm thinking, well, geez, science can't explain this, but I can't figure out how I can integrate this. So, but I told Patty, I said, I think my daughter did send me a double rainbow once. It was Father's Day 2009. I was sitting on my computer at my desk, probably doing some stuff for school. And my Sherry calls me. She's out with her sister Diane in the back on the deck saying, Dave, come here. I think your daughter sent you a double rainbow. And then we hadn't had any rain. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. And there's this big double rainbow going across the sky. I said, oh, that's pretty cool. And I thought nothing of it. Okay. So after I get on the conversation with Patty, I said, when I see you at the conference, I'm going to give you a great big hug. So I was moderating the last workshop of the day, and sure enough, she was there. So I looked at her and said, Patty Farino. She goes, well, yeah. So I'm Dave Roberts. I'm here to give you that hug. So I give her a hug, and get this. Now, I'm at the end of the conference, Tina. I am my fumes are on fumes. Okay. And I'm tired. She hugs me, and she goes, I think your daughter sent me a rainbow. And I'm over here saying, it's okay, good. I said, oh, that's nice. Not even thinking of the conversation that I had with her 2 weeks earlier where we talked about a rainbow. And then she told me the story later. She said they were driving, it was Route 17 in New Jersey. They were driving, they had a weekend away from, a weekend away from Long Island. She came home early because she wasn't feeling well. And they saw this big double rainbow across Route 17, and there wasn't a rain, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Her husband, Marco, who is as grounded as I am, as far as with science, and he's a graphic designer. He couldn't believe it. He's just thinking, there's not a cloud in the sky. It didn't rain. How did this happen? So Patty's over there taking pictures and a video, and all of a sudden she hears a voice in her head saying to her, I need you to talk to my father. She told me this long after the rainbow story. And so Patty said, well, yeah, I can do that, but who's your father? She goes, she was the guy that you talked to about the conference. So this was September 3rd. The conference was September 10th. There was another workshop in Long Island in November that was being put on by a then colleague of ours called Embracing the Power of Change, which turned out to be a very premonition, it was premonition-like. And she goes, if you can see yourself clear to get down to Long Island, you can stay with me and my husband, and I'll show you my Long Island. So I thought about it for a couple of weeks. And I said, yeah, but I'm going to jump back to just the day after the conference here before I get into it. It's the day after the conference. I'm taking 3 presenters, very spiritually based presenters, up north to a place called Old Forge so they can see the changing of the leaves, because in fall it's beautiful in upstate New York. So they're having this intense conversation. So Tina, I don't know what ever possessed me to do this. I think it was my soul that was crying out before my brain and my heart had a chance to catch up. I looked up at the sky as they were having this conversation and said, I want to be where they are. And all I wanted was to be able to have some increased knowledge of spirituality to get me through the next step. Because even though I was doing what I thought I needed to do to get through my grief as a bereaved parent, my soul said that there was something missing. So I stated my intention to the universe. And intention is to me, a very powerful form of prayer. And when you state your intention to the universe is going to try to find some way to help make that happen. But what happened is I got more than just knowledge of spirituality. I got a whole different perspective. And this happened about 2 weeks after I had stated that intention. I called Patty and said, yeah, I'd like to come down. So she ended up picking me up at the airport. My plane got in 45 minutes early, and that was just all part of, I think, the serendipity of that entire day. We went to the conference. She had a booth. She was overseeing for Angela's house, for the Angel of Hope. We came home at 9. We came to her house at 9:30. Said, get us some comfortable clothes. At that time, she came out, and my daughter was fully present, because the first thing that Patty said to me is, why don't you listen to music anymore? And it wasn't her. It was coming through the spirit of my daughter. Why don't you listen to music anymore? And, Patty had assumed kind of like a very young adult energy. She was sitting cross-legged, and it was like my daughter's spirit had invaded her body, literally. And she was a conduit that entire weekend for those kind of messages. I said, well, I don't listen to music anymore because it reminds me of you. And she goes, well, that's why you should listen to it, because it does remind me of you. And so without getting into further details, because we get into a lot of what transpired with that in the book, that entire weekend was about my daughter coming through, with Patty being a conduit, and with the message being that, you're doing a great job grieving me, but there's other categories of your life that you're missing out on. You're a father, you're a husband, you're a grandfather. You've got two of my brothers that you need to take care of, that you need to be aware of. The message is, I'm always going to be here, but you need to embrace the other categories of your life. And from there, Patty and I had marathon conversations for the next 10 years about how psychology and spirituality could merge to, this joyous union to help individuals transcend challenge, increase our awareness of ourselves and our connection to the world around us, and to connect to something greater than ourselves. The importance of critical thinking, and in terms of belief expansion, Because Patty always said, would always ask me, well, what do you believe? And what you believe, Tina, and what I believe could be totally different, but it all works. It's just our job is to understand it, to respect it, see what we can use, and then just and just come together as opposed to respecting the differences, but yet coming together on the similarities. And from there, it just, just my whole perspective changed. I realized that I could, with Patty's help, that I could transform the relationship with my daughter by maintaining continued bonds and connections with her. That she is always going to be a part of me. I have today integrated the best parts of who she is into the best parts of me to redefine my life narrative. So I tell my students, if you see a lot of young energy coming out at age 68, almost 69, it's probably my daughter, and also my students keep me young as well too. They keep me on my toes. They ask me some great questions, and I just have a blast being around them. So, and I look at all of those students as an extension of my family, and as extensions of my daughter in a lot of ways. But Patty gave me that entire perspective, and whenever she would throw out something, just check this out and see how this resonates. And I called her back later, said, Patty, I think this could work with my science-based brain. And so what I got was a whole new perspective, a perspective that allowed me to find peace, allowed me to accept that I could re-engage in life in a world where my daughter was not physically present, but always spiritually going to be a part of me. And, I still have yearnings, Tina, and I'm always going to have that. I'm still going to miss her. I'm still going to grieve her. Depending on what's going on in the moment, but I look at it as part of the path that I'm going to walk for the rest of my life. Joy, sadness, yearning, they're all going to coexist in that mosaic that I talked about, the mosaic of the path that I now walk. And in a lot of ways now, it's a beautiful mosaic because I learned from the yin and the yang of everything now.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. For the listener who is struggling with the loss of their child, what would you speak to them?
And first of all, we have to wallow in the muck before we can wallow through it. We have to experience every emotion that goes with it. We can't suppress it. We can't run away from it. We have to let really let us envelop us so that if we can learn a couple different things. One, we learn we can survive it, that emotions are temporary. And secondly, that can also be a motivator for us in early grief to reach out for support. I also normalize grief, things like lack of sleep, changes in appetite, what we call brain fog, lack of concentration, all of those. Doesn't mean you're going crazy. All of those are normative processes of grief. Understand that the loss of a child for a parent, there isn't any playbook that could prepare us for that. Okay. There's nothing that can prepare us for that. It's you need to begin to learn to walk in a world that's going to be different. Time is relative. If you take 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, you still made progress. Don't look at the number of years or that you're expected to work through your grief. Go at your own pace. As long as you are making progress, as long as you are moving towards re-engaging in life again, it's all good. And the other thing is to show grace to yourself. You did nothing to cause your child's death. A lot of times parents, and I myself held myself responsible for not having control over a disease that Janine had that was uncontrollable. I said, maybe if I saw the signs sooner, maybe if I wasn't paying so much attention to work in school, I could have gotten her in sooner. I could have seen it sooner. I could have talked to her about going to one more clinical trial. And I did. I said, honey, why don't you try a clinical trial? I can look and get you. But she said, no, I want to be here with my family. And what I've learned is that she taught me, and what I've come to accept is that we live on our own terms and we die on our own terms.
Mm.
And that goes for anybody in the life cycle, especially when we talk about, and she did, especially when you talk about somebody with terminal illness. She was going to live her end chapter of the life the way she saw fit, not the way I wanted her to live it. So unselfishly, I had to let her do that, even though I knew it was going to be the worst pain imaginable in my life. The other thing is see your grief journey through your own eyes, not through the expectations of, oh, others think you should grieve. There's no time frame. You're going to hear, well, 6 months to a year. Have you stopped crying yet, or aren't you over it yet? Those time limited expectations were based a lot on Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, which was designed specifically for terminally ill patients to have an end-of-life vocabulary at their end-of-life chapter. But many in Western society said, well, this is how we grieve. Well, research has proven that we don't grieve in stages. That grief is a circular journey. Yeah, it's like this. It's like here's how you grieve. This is the stages. They all kind of just run into each other. So don't grieve according to anybody else's expectations. Grieve according to your own. And understand that it's not the fastest. It's not he who wins the race is not the fastest. It's the one who stays the course consistently. And as long as you're staying the course consistently, it's all going to be good. Get support, ask for help, be around people that can understand you and understand that relationships are going to change. People that you thought were going to step up don't step up. People that aren't going to step up usually are the ones, people you don't think are going to step up usually do. Be grateful, show gratitude for who you have in your life as opposed to who you don't have in your life. And understand that there are transient angels out there who come into our lives for a moment in time to get us through a specific moment. And we may never see them again, but they serve their purpose. They're also part of that support network as well, too. So,
Thank you. I want to make a bit of a shift. What was the motive behind you starting a podcast?
Well, I had two very pain in the neck students who would not let me off the hook until I did. They had taken multiple classes with me, and they said to me, they said, Dave, you really ought to start. Now, my students call me Dave. I tell them I go on that first name basis with them. I said, look, I wasn't born professor. I wasn't born with these initials after my name. I was born Dave. And besides, we're going to be talking about a very personal topic such as death, dying, and bereavement. We could throw formality out the window. So just call me Dave. And of course, if they're not comfortable calling me Dave, they can call me professor or Mr., but not sir. I draw the line there. I said, I haven't done enough yet to be a sir. And sir was my father. So they kept on me. And, the time wasn't right when they were, I had some other stuff going on. And they said, so how you doing with the podcast? So I looked at them and I said, you're not going to let this go, are you? And they just shook their head. Finally, I talked to my son who has his own Buffalo Bills podcast called Buffalo Bread. And I'm putting in on a bash plug for him. And of course, you're in Chicago, so I don't know how that's going to sit with the Bears fans in Chicago, but
I'm from Chicago. I reside in Virginia.
Oh, you reside in Virginia? Okay, so you're from Chicago. You reside in Virginia. Well, I don't know how that's going to hang out with the Washington Commanders fans or any other team that they root for. So, but anyway, I talked to them, finally got going, started the podcast March 31st. It's called the Teaching Journeys Podcast, and the mantra is we are all students and teachers. You were on the podcast, and we had a great conversation. And I've released right now, it's probably over 70 episodes and RSS and 40 on YouTube. And I had two of my former students, including the one that pushed me to do the podcast as a guest. And I'm glad that they did. And they just said, you ought to take what you learn and teach in the classroom, bring guests in, talk about that, bring guests in that can speak to loss, or who just even have skills that can help individuals get through tragedy. So I've featured a lot of different guests. It's been a lot of fun. I've had so many great conversations with you and a lot of different people who have had very transformative journeys, have done some meaningful work helping individuals transcend challenge. And it's a blast every time I get to record a podcast. So I'm in it now for the duration, Tina. So that's how that happened. Much like in terms of, I know we didn't get to how Patty and I ended up writing a book, but there's a story of that in itself too. So whenever you want to get to that is cool.
Okay. How has podcasting changed your life?
Wow. That's something I really haven't given a lot of thought to in terms of how it's transformed my life. I think how it's changed is I continue to be inspired. And I don't know if it's so much has changed me so much in my life, but one of the things I believe is that what the mantra of the podcast is we're all students and teachers. So let's learn from each other. So every guest I have on, I learn something different from every guest. So I guess what it has taught me, it hasn't taught me so much about transcending tragedy as it talks about that we can learn from anybody at any time, no matter how young and old we are. And every podcast I do, the guest contributors that I have on always have something new to teach me. And so every podcast I have is a learning experience for me. And I look at it that way. I try to establish a platform where I ask the question, let the person answer the question, not talk over them, and essentially just create a space for their story to unfold. And this way I can learn from that as well too. And to me, I consider it to be the podcast to be more of an extension of my own desire to be a learner until I transition to a new dimension. Or as I tell my students, as I begin to dance in another dimension, I'm going to continue to be a learner in this one.
So now I'm intrigued to ask this question. If it doesn't go well, we can edit it out. What did you learn from our conversation when I was on your podcast?
I'll tell you, I learned a lot in the pre-chat from you. In the pre-chat that we had, you struck me as being very businesslike, very organized, to the point, and I could tell that your military training kicked in. And I was kidding. You can edit this. I felt like, geez, I'm getting like a sit rep, you know. So, but also what I learned from you was, I think, the importance of structure. And I've been around a lot of people in the military, and I've appreciated the structure that they've had. So I learned a lot about structure from you. I also learned a lot about how you built a community and how you built a community of support. And that's something that you're masterful at. Because, I mean, one of the things I think you recognized was that I can't do this by myself. There are other individuals out there that are walking the same path. Let's establish a community where we can all form that web of connection, where we're connected by a single thread. And the other thing that I learned, and it was also, is that you don't miss a trick. One of the things that you've started is a peer support group for widowers, for men.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot out there for widowers. I think there was one group I think I recall in the past that was done in North Carolina for widowers. And I'm thinking to myself, the other thing I learned is also to look beyond, from you, is to look beyond the obvious, to dream, to project, to plan, and say, how can we make this bigger? How can we establish our web of support to include other individuals who have experienced the loss of a spouse? So I learned about structure, I learned about discipline, and I also learned about how to effectively build communities from our pre-chat and from our podcast.
Wow, thank you. So during the podcast, was I as rigid as you thought during the pre-chat, or did that change? Or
that changed. You
were surprised by that then?
I was surprised that you because it was like literally, but I respected that from you because I've been around a lot of, I mean, my mentor, I don't know if I told you the story, but my work mentor was a clinical social worker and an ex-Navy SEAL commander.
Oh my.
So you want to talk about, he was the best administrator and clinician combined that I'd ever seen in my life.
Yes.
And typically a lot of clinicians who ascend the ranks of supervision, a lot of times don't have the prerequisite skills. It's not any of their fault of their own. It's just that they were promoted through merit as a clinician, but there's a lot of skills that require being a leader that are different from being a clinician. So, but I found that, I said, yeah, you were more relaxed and more kind of like, but boy, when I first met you, I said, she's all business. And I respected that. It was like, and I respected that. I was like, I told you before, I was getting a sit rep. And in terms of this is what I do, this is how we're going to do this. And I didn't take offense to that at all. In fact, I smiled because it reminded me of my mentor. And so I learned a lot about disciplines, structure, but also now flexibility within structure and building communities. So if you want to edit any of that out, you can. But
no, I'm going to keep it. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure you're going to say, I really don't remember anything that I learned from that conversation. It was going to be value added, but that was a pleasant surprise. I wasn't fishing, but since you made mention of it, I was curious to know. So no, thank you.
But I could tell you the other thing I learned is that I could work with you and for you because you're consistent. You're not wishy-washy. That's the other thing I learned about you. You're very definitive about you're very, you wear your beliefs out on your sleeve. You're very definitive with what you want. And as you know, leaders who wear their beliefs on their sleeves sometimes become a target for others who are intimidated by that.
That is certain to that. And I am very business oriented, but at the same part, extremely fun and flexible. But when we're doing this, I need to be doing this, and that can wait for another. So there is a lot to be said. Spot on. So I wanted to talk about the book you and Patty wrote after we talked about the 7 years. I don't know how we skirted off, but I'm gonna weave us back to from so it went from that moment that you had with her. It obviously changed your life, and how did it move into the book?
Well, first of all, one of the questions that a lot of people might be curious to ask is, did I believe what was happening with Patty? And Tina, I didn't question it. I I got right in line with it. I believed what was happening because I had asked for this. Actually, what I asked for, what I got exceeded what I asked for. I said, I want to be where they are. And what I got was not only did I get some more spiritual knowledge and tutelage from Patty, I got a whole different perspective on life, death, and life after death.
Oh, it was my assumption you believed it all
Yeah,
because you made that statement about you wanted to
yep,
when you said you wanted what they wanted, it seemed to me you wanted that veil to be removed so
yep,
you could see past what your limitations were
yep,
or what you had believed or assumed up until this point in life, and you wanted that knowledge. So that seemed like a box check to
yep,
me automatically. But thank you for asserting that statement to confirm.
yep. So I had throughout our conversations, I said, Patty, we ought to write a book. We ought to write a book. People need to know what you did for me. And Patty would never see herself as a medium. She does not like to be categorized as a medium. She is a person that walks a sacred path and that has a very deep and very reverent relationship with spirit. And she sees what she does as helping others and that walk into her path. So she told me, don't call me a medium. And I haven't, and I wouldn't, at that point. But she's just a person that is very intuitive, is connected to the spirit world, and is a conduit for messages that she believes are going to help others, others find peace. So I said, and she's always been a very private person. So I said, and I mentioned it 2020 or 20 during the pandemic. I said, Patty, we ought to really consider writing a book. And she finally agreed. So she moved to South Carolina. She moved, I think it was January 17th. I want to say the pandemic was 2020 is when everything kind of shut down. She moved the day that the first case of COVID got diagnosed in Long Island. She got out of there and they moved to South Carolina. So through Google Docs and through the internet, we wrote the book together. And I had to, a lot of times what she was, and this was a spirit driven book in a lot of ways. She would be spewing out information so fast. I would try to write it down. I said, Pat, I said, I can't, I got it. So I bought a micro recorder and I recorded our sessions and then I would transcribe them and then we would edit them together. So we put the book together. It was a self-published book through Amazon. Her husband, Marco, is a graphic designer. He did the book cover. He did the book layout. He did everything. And he just did a brilliant job. I mean, I call him the best graphic designer on the planet. And just and I got the book. I could just show the cover if you're interested. But this is the cover of the book. And you'll see how he's got kind of like the light from the spirit figure kind of just touching the tip of the subtitle. The handwriting on the blackboard, what do you believe? That's my handwriting. He asked me to do a sample of my handwriting and take a picture of it. And he has a program that took the writing off of the picture and he put it on the blackboard. Just these little touches. And this is an actual classroom that Patty had, one of my classrooms that Patty had. When she took a trip down here, she talked to my students. And
The double rainbow.
the double rainbow, yep. So you're walking from the door to the classroom, the door right out into the double rainbow and into another dimension. It's kind of a pretty cool cover. And he
Yeah.
did the entire design, back, front cover, everything. And he just did put the book together in Kindle form. He did everything. So this was very much a family run operation because Marco and family are my brothers and sisters from another mother. And, we consider ourselves to be family. So it was truly a family project. The book has gotten some really great reviews on Amazon. We're grateful that it's been of help and of comfort, and it's opening up individuals to a different perspective. And certainly, I'm not expecting everybody to obviously embrace totally the perspective, but essentially just use some critical thinking and see what parts of that can apply to you, or look at the possibilities that there's a lot of things that occur in life that the physical world can't explain or that science by itself can't explain. But yet we can be touched by it. We can see it as real. We can be transformed by it.
I would agree. When you were looking forward to this conversation, were there topics you wanted to cover that we've not reached upon yet?
No, I trusted that you were going to cover what needed to be covered, and basically you said we're going to have a conversation. So with that, I just said, let's just see where the conversation goes. And I think we've covered, I think, a lot of territory in the time that we've had. So, and I'll go anywhere else you want to take me to. So
I know we've spoken before, but I try to give people opportunity to see if they have any questions of me.
no, I think you've answered all the questions, I think, with the podcast that you did with me. And also when we talked about what I learned from the podcast, those from you, what
Mhm.
I learned, I think we're good. I guess maybe the only other question I guess I would ask, if you don't mind, is where do you see your mission going at this point? How do you see it expanding for yourself? And what can I do to have my audience kind of align with that?
Thank you. That's a good question. What I would see in the process of what Widowhood Real Talk with Tina is doing as far as this nonprofit, my next goal is to start conducting grief garden ceremonies. And the goal is by the summer of 2026 to have our first grief garden ceremony. There is an underprivileged area here in Virginia, Norfolk, that has a mean income of about 55 to $35,000. And somebody says, why have it there? Well, to me, from what I've been able to gather, when you have an income of that level, when you experience death, you don't have the opportunity to take off work for 3 to 6 months
Right.
and feel your feelings. You are going right back to work with dealing with one of the most mentally compromising experiences of your life.
Yep.
You may struggle with the ability to connect with mental health professionals. So, along with the grief garden, we also want to start conducting grief cafes. And what those look like, I'm not sure if you've heard of that term, but
Yeah.
so what
Grief cafes, death dinners. Yeah. I've heard.
yes, so we've already partnered with an area that will allow us to have their meeting room to use to do that and be able to bring mental health professionals in a very lax environment. Is it a whole therapy scenario? No, but it's a soft start for someone that may not be open to working with a mental health professional. So that is our goal for 2026, 2027. The next goal would be to start a scholarship fund in my husband's name, because when someone loses a loved one, it impacts sometimes the family economically.
Yeah, it sure does.
And for our children to be able to go to college, to know that there's a college fund specifically dealing with parents that are trying to send their, or maybe the one of the partners need to go back to school
Mm.
because their life has been dramatically changed, trying to now run this life on one income that was built onto your mortgage payment doesn't go away when your spouse dies.
No.
There are a lot of things. You have these two cars, you have this life that has been developed, and you may transition to something smaller, but it may require you to go back to work if you were a stay-at-home mom or try to reinvent. So the college fund. But as far as something immediate to do, in August, from August 4th through the 10th, we are having an event called Walk for Love. And what that is, we ask people to walk 1 mile a day. And because when you are grieving, I'm sure you can relate to this, you isolate, you become withdrawn. And being able to walk 1 mile can help people with their health. Oftentimes, when you are grieving, your health is impacted. And walking 1 mile a day, getting some vitamin D. And then we ask people to put a hashtag up called Walk for Love. It's also a fundraiser because we are a nonprofit. So people will purchase the merch. We have different shirts. Some people raise money based on the miles that they walk, and people contribute for that. And people put up the hashtag Walk for Love, and then they're honoring their loved one at the same time as they're working on their health and
Mhm.
well-being.
Yeah, and you're right too, particularly because physical health can tend to be compromised because, especially in early grief,
Yes,
we're so tired and so fatigued. The last thing we want to do is move, and
exactly.
exactly what we need to do is move, even if it's just for a few minutes at a time. So yeah, I'll be happy to share that with on social media with everybody else.
Mhm.
If you post it on LinkedIn, I'll repost it and I'll help get the word out. But I
Or
think,
maybe your group can start their own team, and you can be one of the team members in fundraising of it.
yeah, I mean, say about that as well too, because I facilitate a grief group once a month. I'll see if that's something they'd be interested in doing.
Certainly. And it literally, some of the participation is really just walking the mile every day and posting where you walk, the picture, hashtag walk for love, hashtag WRTWT, that right there, because literally other people will know they are not alone.
Yep.
There are other people going through this journey with them. So it costs you nothing but to benefit your health to walk 1 mile and to post the hashtag.
And I think also trying to expand your support services, with the grief garden and death cafes, and I think is important because one of the things I mean I broke into the human service field in 1986, and there was always a resource issue. There were more
Mm,
individuals that needed mental health and addiction treatment than there were mental health and addiction providers. And we're still running into that today. I mean, I hear stories from individuals. There's like a month waiting list to get into some place. If you got somebody who's depressed, anxious, and suicidal, they can't wait a month. You know,
right.
they're looking at primarily crisis services, and it's just something that there needs to be more resources. And I think that's why when you have good support networks that can, and there's a lot of individuals depending on their past experiences, don't trust mental health professionals or
This is true.
trust more individual. They may trust more individuals in their church community or support group than they would, mental health providers, depending on past history. So I think the more support that we can have to kind of complement existing mental health services, I think is more the better. So yeah, I'll be happy to get the word out on anything you got going on with that.
Thank you. I appreciate you wanting to have this conversation with me. Thank you for allowing us to honor Janine's memory and to keep that alive. I will allow you to wrap up this conversation and close it out and speak to our listeners.
Well, first of all, Tina, thank you for having me on the podcast. It was just a great experience. I enjoyed our conversation. And I mean, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my journey, talk about what I've learned, talk about how I've transformed grief, and in particular, talk about Janine. One of the things, there's a couple of things, and I've had Neil Peart, the late great drummer from Rush, in my head all day today. Neil Peart was one of to me, the best drummer, lyricist, and also a writer on the planet. He had his own set of tragedies. His common law wife and his daughter transitioned within 10 months of each other,
Mm,
in 1997 and 1998. And about a year after his daughter transitioned, he took a 55,000-mile road trip to find himself through the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and resurfaced 4 years later. He took a hiatus from his band, resurfaced 4 years later, wrote a book about his travels called Ghost Rider Travels on the Healing Road. And there's a couple of things quotes that from that book that resonated with me. And the first is about forgiveness, because a lot of times one of the things we struggle with is forgiving ourselves, forgiving others after tragedy. And one of the things that he said, and I think I'm going to get this quote almost right, is he said, there would be no life for me or no peace for me if I didn't learn to forgive life for what it had done for me, forgive others for being alive, and eventually forgive myself for being alive. And that resonated with me because I struggled with all of that. So so to segue for that, show grace to yourself, forgive yourself for whatever you think you might have done or you didn't do or you didn't see. Because if we loved our transition loved ones. We did everything we did out of love. And because of that, there's nothing we need to forgive ourselves for. So forgive yourself if you need to, because you do matter. And the world is a better place with you in it than out of it. So beg for forgiveness. The other thing we talked about support. This is another quote from his book, and also I think from one of his songs that he wrote, is that we are islands to each other, building hopeful bridges on the troubled sea. And so we can all be islands to each other in grief. We may be islands that are separate, but yet we can come together to help each other work through our pain, to help us transform our grief and help us re-engage in life again. We can't do it by ourselves. And don't think you have to. And first and finally, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, show grace to yourself. You do matter. So that's all I got for now.
Thank you so much for being here, Dave. You have a good evening, and thank you, Widowhood, for being here with us.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Widowhood, for being with me as well, and for holding space for my story. It's much appreciated.
Thank you for spending another episode with Widowhood Real Talk. If you found the contents of today helpful, share the episode to anyone you know who may need it. Subscribe to the show and tune into Widowhood Real Talk each week. Then visit widowhood-realtalkwithtina.org to join the community and access additional resources. Remember, you are not alone in this journey.